The Battle of Iwo Jima, or Operation Detachment, was a major battle in which the United States Armed Forces fought for and captured the island of Iwo Jima from the Japanese Empire. The American invasion had the goal of capturing the entire island, including its 3 airfields, to provide a staging area for attacks on the Japanese main islands. This 5-week battle comprised some of the fiercest and bloodiest fighting of the war in the Pacific of World War II. After the heavy losses incurred in the battle, the strategic value of the island became controversial. It was useless to the U.S. Army as a staging base and useless to the U.S. Navy as a fleet base. The Imperial Japanese Army positions on the island were heavily fortified, with a dense network of bunkers, hidden artillery positions, and 18 km of underground tunnels. The Americans on the ground were supported by extensive naval artillery and complete air supremacy over Iwo Jima from the beginning of the battle by U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aviators. Iwo Jima was the only battle by the U.S. Marine Corps in which the overall American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese, although Japanese combat deaths were thrice those of the Americans throughout the battle. Of the 22,000 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima at the beginning of the battle, only 216 were taken prisoner, some of whom were captured because they had been knocked unconscious or otherwise disabled. The majority of the remainder were killed in action, although it has been estimated that as many as 3,000 continued to resist within the various cave systems for many days afterwards, eventually succumbing to their injuries or surrendering weeks later. Despite the bloody fighting and severe casualties on both sides, the Japanese defeat was assured from the start. Overwhelming American superiority in arms and numbers as well as complete control of air power coupled with the impossibility of Japanese retreat or reinforcement permitted no plausible circumstance in which the Americans could have lost the battle. The battle was immortalized by Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the raising of the U.S. flag on top of the 166 am Mount Suribachi by 5 U.S. Marines and 1 U.S. Navy battlefield hospital corpsman. The photograph records the second flag raising on the mountain, both of which took place on the 5th day of the 35-day battle. Rosenthal's photograph promptly became an indelible icon of that battle, of that war in the Pacific, and of the Marine Corps itself and has been widely reproduced. Background: after the American capture of the Marshall Islands, and the devastating air attacks against the Japanese fortress island of Truk Atoll in the Carolines in January 1944, the Japanese military leaders re-evaluated their situation. All indications pointed to an American drive toward the Mariana Islands and the Carolines. To counter such an offensive, the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy established an inner line of defenses extending generally northward from the Carolines to the Marianas, and thence to Japan via the Volcano Islands, and westward from the Marianas via the Carolines and the Pile Islands to the Philippines. In March 1944, the Japanese 31st Army, commanded by General Hideyoshi Obata, was activated to garrison this inner line. The commander of the Japanese garrison on Chichijima was placed nominally in command of Army and Navy units in the Volcano Islands. After the American conquest of the Marianas, daily bomber raids from the Marianas hit the mainland as part of Operation Scavenger. Iwo Jima served as an early warning station that radioed reports of incoming bombers back to mainland Japan. This allowed Japanese air defenses to prepare for the arrival of American bombers. After the U.S. seized bases in the Marshalls in the battles of Kwajalein and Eniwetok in February 1944, Japanese Army and Navy reinforcements were sent to Iwo Jima. 500 men from the naval base at Yokosuka and 500 from Chichijima reached Iwo Jima during March and April 1944. At the same time, with reinforcements arriving from Chichijima and the home islands, the Army garrison on Iwo Jima reached a strength of more than 5,000 men. The loss of the Marianas during the summer of 1944 greatly increased the importance of the Volcano Islands for the Japanese, who were aware that the loss of these islands would facilitate American air raids against the home islands, disrupting war manufacturing and severely damaging civilian morale. Final Japanese plans for the defense of the Volcano Islands were overshadowed by the fact that the Imperial Japanese Navy had already lost almost all of its power, and it could not prevent American landings. Moreover, Aircraft losses throughout 1944 had been so heavy that, even if war production were not affected by American air attacks, combined Japanese air strength was not expected to increase to 3,000 warplanes until March or April 1945. Even then, these planes could not be used from bases in the home islands against Iwo Jima because their range was not more than 900 km. Besides this, all available warplanes had to be hoarded to defend Taiwan and the Japanese home islands from any attack. Adding to their woes, there was a serious shortage of properly trained and experienced pilots and other aircrew to man the warplanes Japan had because such large numbers of pilots and crewmen had perished fighting over the Solomon Islands and during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in mid-1944. In a post-war study, Japanese staff officers described the strategy that was used in the defense of Iwo Jima in the following terms. In the light of the above situation, seeing that it was impossible to conduct our air, sea, and ground operations on Iwo Island, Jima toward ultimate victory, it was decided that to gain time necessary for the preparation of the homeland defense, our forces should rely solely upon the established defensive equipment in that area, checking the enemy by delaying tactics. Even the suicidal attacks by small groups of our Army and Navy airplanes, the surprise attacks by our submarines, and the actions of parachute units, although effective, could be regarded only as a strategical ruse on our part. It was a most depressing thought that we had no available means left for the exploitation of the strategical opportunities which might from time to time occur in the course of these operations. At the end of the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines, the Allies were left with a 2-month lull in their offensive operations before the planned invasion of Okinawa. Iwo Jima was strategically important. It provided an air base for Japanese fighter planes to intercept long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers, and it provided a haven for Japanese naval units in dire need of any support available. In addition, it was used by the Japanese to stage air attacks on the Mariana Islands from November 1944 through January 1945. The capture of Iwo Jima would eliminate these problems and provide a staging area for Operation Downfall, the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. The distance of B-29 raids could be cut in half, and a base would be available for P-51 Mustang fighters to escort and protect the bombers. Intelligence sources were confident that Iwo Jima would fall in 1 week. In light of the optimistic intelligence reports, the decision was made to invade Iwo Jima. This amphibious landing was given the code name Operation Detachment. They were unaware that the Japanese were preparing a complex and deep defense, radically departing from their usual strategy. So successful was the Japanese preparation that it was discovered after the battle that the hundreds of tons of Allied bombs and thousands of rounds of heavy naval gunfire left the Japanese defenders almost unscathed and ready to inflict losses on the U.S. Marines unprecedented up to that point in the Pacific War. Planning and preparation. Japanese preparations. By June 1944, Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi was assigned to command the defense of Iwo Jima. Kurabayashi knew that Japan could not win the battle, but he hoped to inflict massive casualties on the American forces, so that the United States and its Australian and British allies would reconsider carrying out the invasion of Japan home islands. While drawing inspiration from the defense in the Battle of Peleliu, Kurabayashi designed a defense that broke with Japanese military doctrine. Rather than establishing his defenses on the beach to face the landings directly, he created strong, mutually supporting defensive defenses in depth using static and heavy weapons such as heavy machine guns and artillery. Takaichi Nishi's armored tanks were to be used as camouflaged artillery positions. Because the tunnel linking the mountain to the main forces was never completed, Kurabayashi organized the southern area of the island in and around Mount Suribachi as a semi-independent sector, with his main defensive zone built up in the north. The expected American naval and air bombardment further prompted the creation of an extensive system of tunnels that connected the prepared positions, so that a pillbox that had been cleared could be reoccupied. This network of bunkers and pillboxes favored the defense. Hundreds of hidden artillery and mortar positions along with landmines were placed all over the island. Among the Japanese weapons were 320 mm spigot mortars and a variety of explosive rockets. numerous Japanese snipers and camouflaged machine gun positions were also set up. Kurabayashi specially engineered the defenses so that every part of Iwo Jima was subject to Japanese defensive fire. He also received a handful of kamikaze pilots to use against the enemy fleet. 318 American sailors were killed by kamikaze attacks during the battle. However, against his wishes, Kurabayashi's superiors on Honshu ordered him to erect some beach defenses. These were the only parts of the defenses that were destroyed during the pre-landing bombardment. Amphibious landing. Starting on June 15, 1944, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army Air Forces began naval bombardments and air raids against Iwo Jima that would become the longest and most intense conflict in the Pacific theater. These would contain a combination of naval artillery shellings and aerial bombings that went on for 9 months. Major General Harry Schmidt of the Marine Corps requested a 10-day heavy shelling of Iwo Jima before the amphibious assault, but was given only 3 days, and these were impaired by the weather conditions. Each heavy warship was given an area on which to fire that, combined with all the ships, covered the entire island. Each warship fired for approximately 6 hours before stopping for a certain amount of time. On June 17, the destroyer escort Usa Blessman sent Underwater Demolition Team 15 toward Blue Beach for reconnaissance. The Japanese infantry fired on them, killing 1 American diver. On the evening of June 18, the Blessman was hit by a bomb from a Japanese warplane, killing 40 sailors, including 15 members of her UDT. The American bombings and bombardments continued through February 19, 1945, the day of the amphibious landing, known operationally as D-Day. The limited bombardment had questionable success on the enemy due to the Japanese being heavily dug in and fortified. However, many bunkers and caves were destroyed during the bombing, giving it some limited success. The Japanese had been preparing for this battle since March 1944, which gave them a significant head start. By the time of the landing, about 450 American ships were located off Iwo Jima. The entire battle involved about 60,000 U.S. Marines and several thousand U.S. Navy Seabees. At 8:59, 1 minute ahead of schedule, the first of an eventual 30,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division, the 4th Marine Division, and the new 5th Marine Division, making up the V Amphibious Corps, landed on the beach. The initial wave did not come under Japanese fire for some time, as General Kurabayashi's plan was to wait until the beach was full of the Marines and their equipment. Getting off the beach. Many of the Marines who landed in the first wave speculated that perhaps the naval and air bombardment had killed all of the Japanese defenders. In the deathly silence, they became somewhat unnerved as Marine patrols began to advance inland in search of the Japanese positions. Only after the front wave of Marines reached a line of Japanese bunkers defended by machine gunners did they take hostile fire. Many concealed Japanese bunkers and firing positions opened up, and the first wave of Marines took devastating losses from the machine guns. Aside from the Japanese defenses situated on the beaches, the Marines faced heavy fire from Mount Suribachi at the south of the island. It was extremely difficult for the Marines to advance because of the inhospitable terrain, which consisted of volcanic ash. This ash allowed for neither a secure footing nor the construction of foxholes to protect the Marines from hostile fire. However, the ash did help to absorb some of the fragments from Japanese artillery. The Japanese heavy artillery in Suribachi opened their reinforced steel doors to fire, and then closed them immediately to prevent counterfire from the Marines and naval gunners. This made it difficult for American units to destroy a piece of Japanese artillery. To make matters worse for the Americans, the bunkers were connected to the elaborate tunnel system so that bunkers that were cleared with flamethrowers and grenades were reoccupied shortly afterwards by Japanese troops moving through the tunnels. This tactic caused many casualties among the Marines, as they walked past the reoccupied bunkers without expecting to suddenly take fresh fire from them. The Marines advanced slowly under heavy machine gun and artillery fire. With the arrival of armored tanks, and by the use of heavy naval artillery and aerial bombing on Mount Suribachi, the Marines were able to advance past the beaches. 760 Marines made a near-suicidal charge across to the other side of Iwo Jima on that first day. They took heavy casualties, but they made a considerable advance. By the evening, the mountain had been cut off from the rest of the island, and 30,000 Marines had landed. About 40,000 more would follow. In the days after the landings, the Marines expected the usual Japanese banzai charge during the night. This had been the standard Japanese final defense strategy in previous battles against enemy ground forces in the Pacific, such as during the Battle of Saipan. In those attacks, for which the Marines were prepared, the majority of the Japanese attackers had been killed and the Japanese strength greatly reduced. However, General Kurabayashi had strictly forbidden these human wave attacks by the Japanese infantrymen because he considered them to be futile. The fighting on the beachhead at Iwo Jima was very fierce. The advance of the Marines was stalled by numerous defensive positions augmented by artillery pieces. There, the Marines were ambushed by Japanese troops who occasionally sprang out of tunnels. At night, the Japanese left their defenses under cover of darkness to attack American foxholes, but U.S. Navy ships fired star shells to deny them the cover of darkness. Many Japanese soldiers who knew English would deliberately call for a Navy corpsman, and then shoot them as they approached. The Marines learned that firearms were relatively ineffective against the Japanese defenders and effectively used flamethrowers and grenades to flush out Japanese troops in the tunnels. One of the technological innovations of the battle, the 8 Sherman M4A303 medium tanks equipped with a flamethrower, proved very effective at clearing Japanese positions. The Shermans were difficult to disable, such that defenders were often compelled to assault them in the open, where they would fall victim to the superior numbers of Marines. Close air support was initially provided by fighters from escort carriers off the coast. This shifted over to the 15th Fighter Group, flying P-51 Mustangs, after they arrived on the island on March 6. Similarly, illumination rounds which were used to light up the battlefield at night were initially provided by ships, shifting over later to landing force artillery. Navajo code talkers were part of the American ground communications, along with walkie-talkies and SCR-610 backpack radio sets. After running out of water, food and most supplies, the Japanese troops became desperate toward the end of the battle. Kurabayashi, who had argued against banzai attacks at the start of the battle, realized that defeat was imminent. Marines began to face increasing numbers of nighttime attacks. These were only repelled by a combination of machine gun defensive positions and artillery support. At times, the Marines engaged in hand-to-hand fighting to repel the Japanese attacks. With the landing area secure, more troops and heavy equipment came ashore, and the invasion proceeded north to capture the airfields and the remainder of the island. Most Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Raising the flag. Raising the flag on Iwo Jima is a historic photograph taken on February 23, 1945 by Joe Rosenthal. It depicts 5 Marines and a U.S. Navy corpsman raising the flag of the United States atop Mount Suribachi. The photograph was extremely popular, being reprinted in thousands of publications. Later, it became the only photograph to win the Pulitzer Prize for Photography in the same year as its publication, and ultimately came to be regarded as one of the most significant and recognizable images of the war, and possibly the most reproduced photograph of all time. Of the 6 men depicted in the picture, 3 did not survive the battle. The 3 survivors became celebrities upon the publication of the photo. For a while, it was believed that the man now known to be Block was actually Hank Anson, but Hayes set the record straight. The picture was later used by Felix de Weldon to sculpt the Marine Corps War Memorial, located adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery. By the morning of February 23, Mount Suribachi was effectively cut off above ground from the rest of the island. The Marines knew that the Japanese defenders had an extensive network of below-ground defenses, and knew that in spite of its isolation above ground, the volcano was still connected to Japanese defenders via the tunnel network. They expected a fierce fight for the summit. 2 four-man patrols were sent up the volcano to reconnoiter routes on the mountain's north face. Popular legend has it that the Marines fought all the way up to the summit. Although American riflemen expected an ambush, they encountered only small groups of Japanese defenders on Suribachi. The majority of the Japanese troops stayed in the tunnel network, only occasionally attacking in small groups, and were generally all killed. The patrols made it to the summit and scrambled down again, reporting the lack of enemy contact to Colonel Chandler Johnson. Johnson then called for a platoon of Marines to climb Suribachi. With them, he sent a small American flag to fly if they reached the summit. The Marines again anticipated an ambush, but they reached the top of Mount Suribachi without incident. Using a length of pipe they found among the wreckage atop the mountain, the Marines hoisted the U.S. flag over Mount Suribachi, the first foreign flag to fly on Japanese soil. A photograph of this first flag raising was taken by photographer Louis R. Lowry. As the flag went up, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal had just landed on the beach at the foot of Mount Suribachi and decided that he wanted the flag as a souvenir. Popular legend has it that Colonel Johnson wanted the flag for himself, but, in fact, he believed that the flag belonged to the 2nd Battalion 28th Marines, who had captured that section of the island. Johnson sent Sergeant Mike Strank to take a second flag up the volcano to replace the first. It was as the replacement flag went up that Rosenthal took the famous photograph raising the flag on Iwo Jima. Northern Iwo Jima. Despite Japan's loss of Mount Suribachi on the south end of the island, the Japanese still held strong positions on the north end. The rocky terrain vastly favored defense, even more so than Mount Suribachi, which was much easier to hit with naval artillery fire. Coupled with this, the fortifications constructed by Kurabayashi were more impressive than at the southern end of the island. Remaining under the command of Kurabayashi was the equivalent of 8 infantry battalions, a tank regiment, and 2 artillery and 3 heavy mortar battalions. Also he had about 5,000 gunners and naval infantry. The most arduous task left to the Marines was the overtaking of the Motoyama Plateau with its distinctive Hill 382 and Turkey Knob and the area in between referred to as the amphitheater. This formed the basis of what came to be known as the meat grinder. While this was being achieved on the right flank, the left was clearing out Hill 362 with just as much difficulty. The overall objective at this point was to take control of Airfield No. 2 in the center of the island. However, every penetration seemed to become a disaster as units were raked from the flanks, chewed up or sometimes wiped out. Tanks were destroyed by interlocking fire or were hoisted into the air on the spouting fireballs of buried mines. As a result, the fighting bogged down, with American casualties piling up. Even capturing these points was not a solution to the problem since a previously secured position could be attacked from the rear by the use of the tunnels and hidden pillboxes. As such, it was said that they could take these heights at will, and then regret it. The Marines nevertheless found ways to prevail under the circumstances. It was observed that during bombardments, the Japanese would hide their guns and themselves in the caves only to reappear when the troops would advance and lay devastating fire on them. The Japanese had over time learned basic American strategy, which was to lay heavy bombardment before an infantry attack. Consequently, General Erskine ordered the 9th Marine Regiment to attack under the cover of darkness with no preliminary barrage. This came to be a resounding success with many soldiers taken out while still sleeping. This was a key moment in the capture of Hill 362. It held such importance that the Japanese organized a counterattack the following night. Although Kurabayashi had forbidden the suicide charges familiar with other battles in the Pacific, the commander of the area decided on a banzai charge with the optimistic goal of recapturing Mount Suribachi. On the evening of March 8, Captain Samoji Inu and his 1,000 men charged the American lines, inflicting 347 casualties. The Marines counted 784 dead Japanese soldiers the next day. There was also a kamikaze air attack on the ships anchored at sea on February 21, which resulted in the sinking of the escort carrier USS Bismarck C, severe damage to USS Saratoga and slight damage to the escort carrier USS Lunga Point, an LST and a transport. Although the island was declared secure at 18 o'clock on March 16, the 5th Marine Division still faced Kurabayashi's stronghold in a gorge 640 am long at the northwestern end of the island. On March 21, the Marines destroyed the command post in the gorge with 4 tons of explosives, and on March 24, Marines sealed the remaining caves at the northern tip of the island. However, on the night of March 25, a 300-man Japanese force launched a final counterattack in the vicinity of Airfield No. 2. Army pilots, Seabees and Marines of the 5th Pioneer Battalion and 28th Marines fought the Japanese force for up to 90 minutes but suffered heavy casualties. 2 Marines from the 36th Depot Company, an all-African-American unit, received the Bronze Star. First Lieutenant Harry Martin of the 5th Pioneer Battalion was the last Marine to be awarded the Medal of Honor during the battle. Although still a matter of speculation because of conflicting accounts from surviving Japanese veterans, it has been said that Kurabayashi led this final assault, which, unlike the loud banzai charge of previous battles, was characterized as a silent attack. If ever proven true, Kurabayashi would have been the highest-ranking Japanese officer to have personally led an attack during World War II. Additionally, this would also be Kurabayashi's final act, a departure from the normal practice of the commanding Japanese officers committing seppuku behind the lines while the rest perished in the banzai charge, as happened during the battles of Saipan and Okinawa. The island was officially declared secure at 9 o'clock on March 26. Weapons. A weapon heavily used in the Pacific was the United States M2 flamethrower. It features 2 tanks containing fuel and compressed gas respectively, which are combined and ignited to produce a stream of flaming liquid out of the tip. These flamethrowers were used to kill Japanese hold-into pillboxes, buildings and caves. A battalion would assign 1 flamethrower per platoon with 1 reserve flamethrower in each group. Flamethrower operators were usually in more danger than regular troops as the short range of their weapon required close combat, and the visibility of the flames on the battlefield made them a prominent target for snipers. Still, they were essential to breaking the enemy, and one battalion commander called the flamethrower the Oebest single weapon of the operation. Marines later experimented putting flamethrowers on tanks which were also deployed during battle. Their effectiveness was more limited due to Iwo Jima's rough terrain. A flamethrower tank would have a range of approximately 100 ud, carry 300 gallons of fuel and have a firing time of 150 seconds. Aftermath. Of the 22,060 Japanese soldiers entrenched on the island, 18,844 died either from fighting or by ritual suicide. Only 216 were captured during the course of battle. After Iwo Jima, it was estimated there were no more than 300 Japanese left alive in the island's warren of caves and tunnels. In fact, there were close to 3,000. The Japanese Bushido Code of Honor, coupled with effective propaganda which portrayed American GIs as ruthless animals, prevented surrender for many Japanese soldiers. Those who could not bring themselves to commit suicide hid in the caves during the day and came out at night to prowl for provisions. Some did eventually surrender and were surprised that the Americans often received them with compassion, offering water, cigarettes, or coffee. The last of these holdouts on the island, 2 of Lieutenant Toshihiko Ono's men, Yamakage Kyufuku and Matsudo Linsoki, lasted 4 years without being caught and finally surrendered on January 6, 1949. According to the official Navy Department Library website, the 36-day assault resulted in more than 26,000 American casualties, including 6,800 dead. By comparison, the much larger-scale 82-day battle for Okinawa lasting from early April until mid-June 1945 and U.S. resulted in casualties of over 62,000, of whom over 12,000 were killed or missing. Iwo Jima was also the only U.S. Marine battle where the American casualties exceeded the Japanese, although Japanese combat deaths numbered 3 times as many American deaths. 2 U.S. Marines were captured as POWs during the battle. Neither of them would survive their captivity. USS Bismarck C was also lost, the last U.S. aircraft carrier sunk in World War II. Because all civilians had been evacuated, there were no civilian casualties at Iwo Jima, unlike at Saipan and Okinawa. Strategic importance. Given the number of casualties, the necessity and long-term significance of the islands captured to the outcome of the war was a contentious issue from the beginning, and remains disputed. As early as April 1945, retired Chief of Naval Operations William V. Pratt stated in Newsweek magazine that considering the expenditure of manpower to acquire a small, God-forsaken island, useless to the Army as a staging base and useless to the Navy as a fleet base. One wonders if the same sort of airbase could not have been reached by acquiring other strategic localities at lower cost. Pratt did not know, or else could not disclose, that the island's emergency landing field would be useful for the B-29s carrying the atomic bombs destined for Japan in late 1945. The 509th Composite Group practiced mock emergency landings on Iwo Jima at its Utah base opened in December 1944. B-29s were not entirely reliable, and engine failure was common. Due to the scarcity of materials and engineering complexity, replacement of the bombs could take many months or even years. However, Okinawa had also been taken by the time the bombs were dropped. The lessons learned on Iwo Jima served as guidelines for the following Battle of Okinawa and the planned invasion of the Japanese homeland. For example, because of the casualties taken at Iwo Jima on the first day, it was decided to make the preparatory bombardment the heaviest yet delivered onto a Pacific island. Also, in the planning for a potential attack on the Japanese home islands, it was taken into account that around a third of the troops committed to Iwo Jima and again at Okinawa had been killed or wounded. The traditional justification for Iwo Jima's strategic importance to the United States war effort has been that it provided a landing and refueling site for long-range fighter escorts. These escorts proved both impractical and unnecessary, and only 10 such missions were ever flown from Iwo Jima. Other justifications are also debatable. Japanese fighter aircraft based on Iwo Jima sometimes attacked U.S. Army Air Force planes, which were vulnerable on their way to Japan because they were heavily laden with bombs and fuel. However, although some Japanese interceptors were based on Iwo Jima, their impact on the American bombing effort was marginal. In the 3 months before the invasion only 11 B-29s were lost as a result. The superfortresses found it unnecessary to make any major detour around the island. The Japanese on Iwo Jima had radar and were thus able to notify their comrades at home of incoming B-29 superfortresses flying from the Mariana Islands. However, the capture of Iwo Jima did not affect the Japanese early warning radar system, which continued to receive information on incoming B-29s from the island of Rota. As early as March 4, 1945, while fighting was still taking place, the B-29 Dynamite of the USAAF 9th Bomb Group reported it was low on fuel near the island and requested an emergency landing. Despite enemy fire, the airplane landed on the Allied-controlled section of the island, without incident, and was serviced, refueled and departed. In all, 2,251 B-29 landings on Iwo Jima were recorded during the war. Muskin records that 1,191 fighter escorts and 3,081 strike sorties were flown from Iwo Jima against Japan. Some downed B-29 crewmen were saved by air-sea rescue aircraft and vessels operating from the island, but Iwo Jima was only one of many islands that could have been used for such a purpose. As for the importance of the island as a landing and refueling site for bombers, Marine Captain Robert Burrell, then a history instructor at the United States Naval Academy, suggested that only a small proportion of the 2,251 landings were for genuine emergencies, the great majority possibly being for minor technical checkups, training, or refueling. According to Burrell, this justification became prominent only after the Marines seized the island and incurred high casualties. The tragic cost of Operation Detachment pressured veterans, journalists, and commanders to fixate on the most visible rationalization for the battle. The site of the enormous, costly, and technologically sophisticated B-29 landing on the island's small airfield most clearly linked Iwo Jima to the strategic bombing campaign. As the myths about the flag raisings on Mount Suribachi reached legendary proportions, so did the emergency landing theory in order to justify the need to raise that flag. Nevertheless, in promoting his expanded exploration of the issue, The Ghosts of Iwo Jima, Burrell's publishers also claim that the very losses formed the basis for a reverence for the Marine Corps that not only embodied the American national spirit, but ensured the institutional survival of the Marine Corps. Legacy. The United States Navy has commissioned several ships of the name Osa Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1985, the 40th anniversary of the landings, an event called the Reunion of Honor was held. The veterans of both sides who fought in the Battle of Iwo Jima attended the event. The place was the invasion beach where U.S. forces landed. A memorial on which inscriptions were engraved by both sides was built at the center of the meeting place. Japanese attended at the mountain side, where the Japanese inscription was carved, and Americans attended at the shore side, where the English inscription was carved. After unveiling and offering of flowers were made, the representatives of both countries approached the memorial. Upon meeting, they shook hands. The combined Japan-US memorial service of the 50th anniversary of the battle was held in front of the monument in February 1995. Further memorial services have been held on later anniversaries. The importance of the battle to Marines today is demonstrated in pilgrimages made to the island, and specifically the summit of Suribachi. Marines will often leave dog tags, rank insignia, or other tokens at the monuments in homage. Iwo Jima Day is observed annually on February 19 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with a ceremony at the State House. The Japanese government continues to search for and retrieve the remains of Japanese military personnel who were killed during the battle. Medal of Honor Awards. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. It is bestowed on a member of the United States Armed Forces who distinguishes himself by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while engaged in an action against an enemy of the United States. Because of its nature, the medal is commonly awarded posthumously. Since its creation during the American Civil War, it has been presented only 3,464 times. During this one-month-long battle, 27 U.S. military personnel were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions, 14 of them posthumously. Of the 27 medals awarded for the actions at Iwo Jima, 22 were presented to Marines and 5 were presented to United States Navy sailors, 4 of whom were hospital corpsmen. This was 28% of the 82 medals of honor awarded to Marines in the entirety of World War II in the Pacific. Movies and documentaries. To the Shores of Iwo Jima, a 1945 American documentary produced by the United States Navy, Marine Corps and the Coast Guard. Glamour Gal, a 1945 film about Marine artillery. Sounds of Iwo Jima, a 1949 American film starring John Wayne. The Outsider, a 1961 film starring Tony Curtis as the conflicted flag raiser Ira Hayes. Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, 2006 films directed by Clint Eastwood. Flags of Our Fathers is filmed from the American perspective and is based on the book by James Bradley and Ron Powers. Letters from Iwo Jima is filmed from the Japanese perspective. Part 8 of the 2010 HBO miniseries The Pacific, produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, includes part of the Battle of Iwo Jima from the point of view of John Basilone from the beginning of the invasion until his death later in the day. Episode 23 from the acclaimed 1973 Thames television documentary The World at War. Battle Rats, Iwo Jima. The League of Grateful Sons by Vision Forum. See also: List of naval and land-based operations in Pacific Theater during World War II, raising the flag on Iwo Jima, South Field, North Field, Notes. References. Online. External links, media related to Battle of Iwo Jima at Wikimedia Commons.